It is so hot in Johannesburg, scorching really, and in this almost unbearable heat, I can't help but think about growing up in Durban and our family's regular visits to the beach. Many of us who grew up in coastal regions are so nostalgic for those smells and the tastes of being at the ocean. You know what I'm talking about, that smell of sunscreen and the feeling of grains of sea sand sticking to your sunscreen skin, ice cream melting and dripping down your fingers, the feeling of cool water. Well, if you grew up in Durban like I did, the water was always warm, but you know what I mean. The beach just evokes incredible feelings of just being happy and carefree, and I look at that time so fondly. This week on The Story, we have 4 teenagers who were probably looking for that same type of escape. It was a hot day in Cape Town, and they're refugees. They've been living in the Central Methodist Church with their families. They've taken refuge there. And you can imagine the scene for teenagers, tired of being hot and stuffy in that church, tired of church services maybe, of the liturgies, and they head out to the beach. They don't tell anyone where they're going. Unfortunately, in seeking some joy and respite, and we have a story that turns to tragedy when all 4 of these youngsters lose their lives by drowning. This week on The Story, we are looking at what happened. Specifically, we're talking about the incredible effort by Cape Town officials and the National Sea Rescue Institute, or the NSRI, in trying to retrieve the body of the final teenager, whose body evaded them for a few days. It's a double tragedy, really, because not only did these 4 young people lose their lives, but these 4 young people were also part of a group of refugees who'd been treated unfairly in their home country and then faced more hardship back in South Africa. It's a story about 4 young people who tried to get away from a terrible situation and then found themselves in a worse one. You're listening to The Story. It's a new podcast from News 24. Every week, we're going to take you inside our newsroom. We'll speak to journalists and experts about the week's biggest story. This is what we saw, heard, and uncovered this week. News 24's Jenna Etheridge has been covering this story from the very beginning. She's, of course, in our Cape Town office, and we're going to get her on the line now just to talk a little bit more about the story.
Hi, Jerusha.
Hi, Jenna. Thanks so much for joining us today. Jenna, if you would, take us back to when you first heard about the story. How were you tipped off? How did you find out about what was happening?
The tragedy unfolded on Sunday around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The NSRI first heard that 4 teenagers were struggling in the water. And these friends were 2 boys from Burundi. They were 18 and 15. And then a boy and girl from the Congo, aged 16 and 15. And they'd ended up being caught in rip currents after entering the water to swim, when suddenly a wave washed over them. The conditions on that side are pretty rough and also quite deceiving. So I can imagine that it looked very inviting to go in, but they were not realizing that it was potentially a dangerous situation.
Sure, Jenna, that's devastating.
As this was all unfolding, there were already 3 surfers in the water who were actually able to get to one of the boys, the 15-year-old from Burundi, and they managed to put him on their surfboard. Then an NSRI swimmer saw what was happening and swam out to the surfers, who were about 200 meters offshore. And while this boy was on the surfboard, tried to do CPR to save him. And they managed to bring him back to shore and continue CPR, but it was too late for him.
All right, so on Sunday, they're able to retrieve the first body. Can you tell us what happened on Monday?
So working through still rough sea conditions and a search area that wasn't really accessible, the rescue team managed to find the body of the 15-year-old girl from Congo. And then shortly after that, under similar circumstances, the police divers found and recovered the body of the 16-year-old boy from Congo.
Now it's Tuesday, and at this point they've recovered 3 of the bodies of the teenagers. That means that 1 is still in the water. And in fact, many people have said that they could spot this body close to the rocks at this specific beach. Jenna, when you arrive on the scene, what are you seeing and what's happening?
It was quite grim. The boy was lying on his back on the rocks in what I assume was probably his underwear or his swim trunks. And he almost looked peacefully asleep. I mean, had I not known better and seeing the rough sea lapping on the rocks around him and understanding what had happened, it was not good to see, but I think it was too late to unsee.
Of course, Jenna, everything about this story is devastating. But I think one of the things that really stuck out for me and many of our readers this week was the 4th teenager's almost stoic father. His name's Felicien. He's from Burundi, as is his family. And he was on that scene. He was watching everything. And he actually refused to leave until his son's body was recovered. So tell us a little bit about him and what you saw of the father on the scene.
When we got to the scene, it was not long before I identified Felicien as the father. The friends who'd been waiting with Felicien were pleading with the police, get divers in the water, but before it's too late. I think their concern was that the body was going to wash away. It was a realistic concern because the waves were crashing against the wall. And they were saying to the team, don't worry, give us the ropes, give us the ladders, give us the ropes. We'll go over the seawall. We'll get his body. What are we waiting for? I don't think they even thought about the danger. They just wanted to get the body out.
You were able to have an interaction with Felicien, the father. Tell us a bit about that.
I never enjoy speaking to grieving families. It feels very intrusive. And the last thing that I would ever want to do is to make them feel worse. That's always a concern in my head.
Yeah, that's so true, Jenna.
But I also think it's important to speak to grieving families because maybe they want to speak. Maybe they find it cathartic or therapeutic to speak to someone about what happened. So I asked to sit down next to Felicien, and we slowly started chatting, and I asked him how he was holding up. I think the words that stood out for me was, all I want for them is to find my child's body. The next thing I asked him was what his son's name was, because we hadn't really received that information in press releases. And I immediately became curious because he took out his phone and he started scrolling through his photos. He was actually pulling up a photo of his son's legal papers, and he took his finger and pointed at the screen and said, Uwamungu John Damour. That's his name. I asked what his name meant, and he said Uwamungu translates to child of God. It was bizarre that he'd pulled out his son's papers instead of just telling me his name. And I noticed the same thing with his friend Patrick. When I asked for Patrick's name, he did the same thing. He took out his phone and showed me his papers. So it was just, I don't know if that was an automatic reaction, if it's something that they're used to, feeling unwelcome or feeling like they need to prove their existence or prove that they're okay to be somewhere, that's what you would do, is show your papers. It was sad for me. It was just something which stuck out.
So where are we now, Jenna? The 4th body has been recovered. Families at least have the bodies of their loved ones. What will happen now?
Well, the pastor at the Central Methodist Church, Reverend Alan Story, he sent out a newsletter to the congregation basically saying that they already managed to hold one funeral for one of the children, one of the teenagers, and they are now trying to organize the funerals for the other three for sometime later this week. So I think that's the next step. And the Reverend also spoke a little bit about the level of trauma that this tragedy had caused, especially for the young people who witnessed the drowning. I think obviously we focus on the victims, but they had friends who were there with them. So he asked everyone to hold those witnesses in their hearts, the congregation to hold them in their hearts. The Reverend also said that according to the leaders of the refugees, they've undertaken to vacate the church sometime next week. So I think that will be between Tuesday and Thursday. So we'll obviously have to wait and see what happens to them next.
Jenna, thank you so much for your just kind and empathetic reporting on this story. If our listeners want to get a hold of you via Twitter, how can they find you?
They're welcome to get hold of me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @JennaEtheridge.
That's News 24's Jenna Etheridge. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Elizabeth Mamakos is the editor of Parent 24. She's joined us before on this podcast, and we're going to call her now. She's in our Cape Town office. This is obviously every parent's worst nightmare. So Elizabeth's going to talk us through just a couple water and beach safety tips and points for us to take note of as we head into the holiday season. So let's give Elizabeth a call.
Hello.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
This is a horrible topic to have to discuss, and it's not something any parent wants to think about. But the reality is that as we head into the festive season, perhaps there are some things that parents can do to just better equip themselves for their children being around water and the ocean specifically.
Yes, there certainly are. As unpleasant as it is to think that a trip to the beach could end in a tragedy, it's important to be aware of the dangers. For example, stats show that adolescents are most at risk of drowning, and males drown at a higher rate than females in every category. This information is useful to parents because it highlights that their boys are more at risk, but it doesn't mean they can relax around their girls either. Another age group where the risk of drowning is relatively high is the over 60s. So if kids are at the beach with grandparents, for example, perhaps while the parents are at work, it's important to be aware that this is a risky situation. In essence, parents need to know that the sea isn't safe. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Parents can take precautions by warning their kids of the dangers, ensuring their kids are water safe before allowing them into the sea or tidal pools, and by ensuring they only swim in designated areas in calm waters and close to lifeguards. And also know where your child is at all times. And if they can't swim well, then stay within arm's length of them. Don't be distracted by phones or books. It only takes a few seconds for kids to be washed away in a current. And also teach your kids to look out for danger and to look for appropriate help if they realize that they're lost or in danger themselves.
That's so helpful, Elizabeth. Let's just unfortunately go to the worst case scenario. You're on the beach and your child is missing. What do you do? Who do you speak to? What happens?
So immediately contact the lifeguards. They'll guide you in terms of the fastest, most appropriate steps to take for the situation and the location. The NSRI website has a long list of relevant numbers by location, so it's a good idea to make sure you've saved that number before you even head to the beach. Others who are equipped to respond to possible drownings include the South African Police Services, local fire and rescue services, and EMR ambulance services. But also just note, all missing children must be reported to law enforcement immediately so a search can be conducted. And a parent will need to produce a recent photograph of the missing child and be able to share all the required information, such as what the child was wearing, his or her height, age, and so on.
Right. And if you're on the beach and, heaven forbid, you should spot a child in the water in trouble, potentially drowning, what do you do?
So call for help immediately in any way possible. It's a good idea to attract the attention of other beachgoers, as there may be other competent swimmers and surfers, off-duty lifeguards on the beach who can assist. But then as a parent, I must say that once there are professionals on the scene, you'll have to trust them to do the right thing. And as hard as it might be, try to stay calm.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one for any parent or anybody watching the situation. But like you've detailed, we have just incredibly professional and equipped emergency services personnel. So it is the best option for parents just to stay calm and let the professionals do their job. Finally, Elizabeth, I know that we're talking about drownings and water safety in particular, but being out and about on the beaches during this festive season, or any time really, comes with other risks that we sometimes don't think about. So tell us a little bit about that.
So other risks include dunes, which can be dangerous areas for children to play on. So care needs to be taken as sand can shift quickly and cover small children. Digging holes in the beach and burying someone is a fun game, but the incoming tide is actually dangerous, and burying too deep will not allow the buried person space and time to escape should the waves begin to wash over them. And the sand can also move again and cover small children. Also, most people are aware of the dangers of riptides and freak waves and slippery rocks and so on, but they may assume that tidal rivers and lakes are safer, and this isn't necessarily true. In reality, a child can drown as little as 2.5 centimeters of water. So just keep a sharp eye on the kids and be sure to wear the appropriate safety gear when taking boat rides or paddle skiing on the water too.
Sure. I don't think a lot of people realize that it just takes 2.5 centimeters, you said, of water?
Yes.
This has been so helpful, Elizabeth, and I know that Parent24 has got many more resources. So won't you just point us in the direction of maybe some articles or helpful places online where we can go and get more information on this topic?
So on Parent24, we have got many articles about water safety, and we also list phone numbers that you can call, and we have resources that parents can download and print and take with them if they're heading to the beach.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Story is a weekly podcast by News24. It's hosted by me, Jerusha Sukhdeo-Raath, and produced and edited by Nokuthula Manyathi. For more on this story, visit news24.com.